President Yoon Suk Yeol is poised to push for tangible action against North Korea's blatant belligerence amid U.S. intelligence reports that the regime is planning to seal a food-for-weapons deal with Russia. So what are the prospects of regional unity against North Korea's hostile intentions? What are the prospects of trilateral talks among South Korea, China and Japan within this year? And what is the relevance of global gatherings amid brewing geopolitical tensions? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon President Yoon Suk Yeol's latest regional diplomatic mission as he attends a series of ASEAN-related summits in Indonesia starting today, before heading to India to partake in the G20 gathering later this week. For more on this, I have Jack Barton here in the studio with me. Jack, it's a pleasure to have you back.
It's wonderful to be back.
I also have Sebastien Falletti with us. Sebastien, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
Right, Jack, let's begin with what appears to be high on President Yoon Suk Yeol's agenda as he undertakes his latest diplomatic mission.
Well, we've already heard President Yoon addressing the South Korea ASEAN meeting, which is the bloc in just South Korea. And he made it clear that North Korea is right on the top of the agenda. There are other issues, of course, and there's a lot of areas he's seeking engagement in ASEAN: trade, supply line security, aid assistance, many other areas. But North Korea really dominated that address he gave to that meeting, talking about how it's an existential as well as a direct threat to the region. Of course, South Korea very worried at the moment. Also, Europe very worried at the moment, given that it looks like there could be a deal between North Korea and Russia to provide artillery shells. That's the expectation, which would make a big difference in the war in Ukraine. So it is an existential and direct threat to the world. Having said that, will he get traction there? There are a few reasons why it might not. One is because ASEAN is very focused on the South China Sea and Myanmar right now. Just days ahead of the meeting, China announced its 10-dash line, used to be a 9-dash line. This has really infuriated countries, including Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. On top of that, you've got this ongoing, the coup, the result of the coup in Myanmar. And even though from the outside, we don't think it's a strong response. By ASEAN standards, they have had a very strong response, and that's sort of ongoing. And also South Korea. It was very ASEAN-focused under President Moon, but it's sort of stepped back. It's been Indo-Pacific, more engaged with the US. So because of those reasons, there might be some cooperation on smaller areas, but I don't think there'll be a big picture change.
Right, but broadly speaking, Sebastien, what does Korea look to gain amid stronger ties with the ASEAN in terms of security?
Well, like Jack just mentioned, we can see that President Yoon Suk Yeol is like revamping the so-called Southern policy that was advocated by his predecessor, President Moon Jae-in. So there is against at least the will to go south. And the main reason behind, the main rationale behind is that there is a fledgling relationship with China when it comes to geopolitics and economy. Geopolitics because there's a growing alignment with the US, but also economically because we're seeing China's economy stalling, which is a huge challenge for Korea because China is still the #1 trade partner of South Korea. So clearly the incentive to look to diversify your trade relationship is more urgent than ever. And naturally, the South ASEAN, 600 million people, a growing middle class, emerging middle classes, is offering a new horizon, at least a fresh opportunities for Korean companies to develop. They are already very present in some countries like Vietnam, where Korea is really has been focusing most of its investment, but also in Indonesia, income investment, but also, of course, it's a growing consumer market where Korean culture, Hallyu, is very popular. So there is some opportunities there. But still, for South Korea, there's a choice to be made. It's like, until now, as mentioned, I mean, China was the key economic partner, and of course, the Indo-Pacific, the US alliance, Japan was also still the major priority when it comes to security. So the question is how much Korea can be seen as a credible, engaged partner with ASEAN. That's one of the questions.
Right, and before we advance any further, Jack, there has been quite a bit of question about the relevance of the ASEAN in recent years, especially given its lack of action, perhaps, with regard to Myanmar. You mentioned that earlier as well. What are your personal thoughts?
Well, it's funny you say in recent years. I realized before coming on the show, I've been covering ASEAN for a quarter of a century. And every single ASEAN, we ask the same question: is ASEAN relevant? Does it actually do anything? And the answer is always yes and no. In the big picture, we never get bold statements out of ASEAN. We never get big policy shifting directions or a sort of a mass statement of condemnation on a certain act or really anything. But what we do get is incremental change, and we do get countries coming together and maintaining the status quo. And that's important in an area where there are a lot of territorial disputes and conflict over this and that. As the old saying goes, jaw is better than war. And ASEAN brings everybody together. And it is seen at ASEAN that it is very important to turn up, even if you're not a member, if you're part of one of the groupings. So it's right for Yoon to be there. And it will be noted that Yoon is there, and South Korea will be treated differently because Yoon has turned up. It's understandable that Xi Jinping hasn't turned up, given the kind of the shockwave China has sent through with the 10-dash map and probably the criticism, even if it's muted and behind the scenes he would receive. There's probably a huge missed opportunity for Joe Biden not to turn up. Doesn't really matter much for ASEAN, but it'll be a big lost opportunity for the United States to kind of step in and say, okay, at this moment where you are a little bit divided and angry with China, here we are at this meeting. So really turning up is the important thing. It's getting that consensus on board, and President Yoon's definitely done the right thing to turn up, and probably, again, there might be some incremental benefits in terms of North Korea, things like interception of ships at sea that might be smuggling goods, cyber security, those smaller things that might not seem as important as some big announcement, but actually do make a difference.
Right. And in the meantime, Sebastien, on the broader subject of summits themselves, Seoul is hoping to host a trilateral summit among South Korea, China, and Japan within this particular year. What are your thoughts on the prospects of such a trilateral meeting?
Yeah, looking a bit Northeast Asia again, exactly, we are seeing some signaling that finally the dormant trilateral cooperation could maybe come back into life slightly. Just to remember, this was launched in 2008. At that time, the three big economies of Northeast Asia commit to cooperate increasingly to make more Pan-Asian coordination. But of course, all this has been stalled since 2019. There's been no summit. And at that time, the reason for this hiatus was the brewing tension between South Korea and Japan over forced labor history. So at that time, that stalled. And then we had COVID. So now we're, thanks to the better relationship between Korea and Japan, there is an opportunity to potentially relaunch this process. But there is a major problem, is that meanwhile, the relationship with China has worsened seriously over COVID, and especially between South Korea and China. The relationship is increasingly sore because the current administration is also getting more engaged with the US. So the big question is to what extent China is ready to engage into that new process. So we know that there's going to be a senior official meeting of the three countries probably later this month here in Seoul, under the rotating presidency, to try to craft out the idea of having finally another summit, a trilateral summit, again by the end of this year. So that's the goal. It sounds very ambitious when we look at the background, and when you see that even President Xi Jinping is not showing up at the G20, you wonder how you're going to bring these three leaders in the same room while they are disagreeing on some fundamental issue about the Indo-Pacific.
Right, and including, of course, the dispute between Beijing and Tokyo over the Fukushima radioactive wastewater. That being said, Jack, if a trilateral meeting is realized, what issues look to top those talks?
Yeah, again, that's a big if. As Sebastien was saying, it's going to be a process. There'll be that small meeting, and then if that's okay, there'll be deputy foreign ministers, and we're still a long way off. I think the most important thing about this, because of all of that, won't be so much what's on the agenda or whether they can solve big differences, is just that the meeting is happening again. That's a great thing. I covered the World Economic Forum for 7 years in a row, and every time I asked analysts there, where could be the big future flashpoint? Where could World War III start? Always the same answer: East Asia. Always. So that might have changed now with the war in Ukraine, but it was always the same answer, because you have this huge legacy issues, these territorial disputes, militaries acting very close to each other, and no coordination at all between any of the three. No hotlines, no anything. So big talks, big annual talks between the three, where people can sit in the room face to face, discuss ideas, discuss differences, and hopefully slowly move towards mechanisms. Obviously not something like the European Union or something the Europeans came up with in the wake of World War II, where a French person and a German can sit down for dinner now and talk about everything in the world except the war, or even think about it. But here in East Asia, all of those issues still burn bright, and there are no mechanisms in place. We desperately need them. So the meeting alone, if it can be realized, is a great thing, and it should be seen as a great thing. And you know, those differences which really tend to incubate, as we saw during the pandemic, when people are apart and they don't have that opportunity for face-to-face discussions, they can at least get together and sit down and talk. Will we get big resolutions and outcomes? Probably not, but at least the fact they're sitting down and talking means it can be put on the back burner for a little while, and that's a great thing in itself.
Right, hopefully, of course. Sebastien, following the ASEAN-related gatherings in Indonesia, President Yoon Suk Yeol is poised to head over to India for the G20 summit. Now there, he is expected to seek a resolute stance against North Korea's aggressive ambitions by calling for more action to perhaps curb its financing of its weapons technology. Do you, Sebastien, foresee a joint statement?
Well, I mean, in those kind of summits, there's always a very long joint statement. I mean, usually it looks a bit like a Christmas tree, because there's a lot of things hanging there, and of course South Korea will be pushing to add a paragraph or at least a line on the North Korean issue. The question is, the G20 meeting format is normally about mainly the global economy. It was founded to relaunch the global economy in 2008. So there's always an issue about bringing in security issues. Some members will argue that this is not the core issue that this summit should gather. But of course, there will be some push from other powers. So I think it would be possible to see probably a mention. But the question is, what would be the effectiveness? Because of course, what we are seeing today is increasingly a global community, a G20 that is divided between some Western countries with some emerging countries. The war in Ukraine has divided increasingly the grouping, and this G20 meeting is not even complete, since China will not even send its president. It will send its prime minister, Li Qiang. But the absence of Xi Jinping himself doesn't bode well for the outcome of this summit. Maybe there's a reason why Xi Jinping is avoiding this summit, while traveling as far as South Africa a couple of days before. But maybe he doesn't want to hand India and Prime Minister Modi a success on the global stage. Possibly that's one of the explanation. But it remains to be seen what can this G20 achieve in such a tense global geopolitical environment. So North Korea will definitely not be on the top of the agenda of this summit.
Right. You mentioned Ukraine, Sebastien. Now, France, for its part, has spoken about the need for a G20 communique condemning Russia's military confrontation in Ukraine. Do you care to elaborate?
Well, that's actually, I was at the G20 summit last year in Bali, and that was the main item discussed. There was this main battle between European, Western countries and US pushing to add the Ukraine war on the agenda, and then you had a lot of emerging countries there who say, well, this is not the place to discuss this. Eventually they managed to come to a compromise where they mentioned the invasion of Ukraine last year. So this year you could expect a similar kind of a battle. Of course, since there was a precedent, it might be easier to mention, to use the language you agreed upon last November in Indonesia. So it might be a mention, but again, for most countries around the table, the big concern is not directly the Ukraine war, it's more the stage of the global economy. We are most countries are facing increasing challenges, inflation, low growth, low export, the global demand is down. So I think that's the main concern, and so there is a risk of hijacking this meeting toward a more security-centric. So it will tell you how much the world is divided or united in this very challenging context.
Right. Prospects of a communique, the G20 summit, Jack, have been rendered uncertain by perhaps, according to pundits that is, India's strategic ambiguity with regard to the war in Ukraine. Speaking about that, with regard to strategic policies, the Yoon administration has been seeking a clarity, that is, in policy for South Korea. How has this shift in policy perhaps served South Korea's interests, do you think?
Well, it has given clarity, and in the region that's something unusual because there is usually ambiguity in statements and in policy, and there still is, it would have to be said. You know, if you compare it to, say, American policy, there is still a lot of ambiguity. South Korea has made a strong statement on Ukraine, for instance, and yet it tries to maintain ties with Russia, sort of, and it has moved closer to the United States, but at the same time it's trying to keep a close relationship with China. You know, there still is this ambiguity. You could just say it's slightly less ambiguous than it was before. There's a little more clarity. I think at the G20, because it's in India, and for many of the reasons Sebastien just mentioned, it's probably not going to make a big difference. You know, we talk about India's neutrality, but India's not really neutral. India just moves where its interests lie. So we see India joining the Quad, which is a little counterintuitive, but that's because it's having a major conflict with China, an actual conflict, you know, border disputes. There was a war in the 60s, and we've seen lethal engagements between Chinese and Indian soldiers. So it sees the Quad as something that's good for it. It's grouping with Japan, the US, and Australia. What's it going to give the Quad back? Probably nothing at all. India goes where India's interests are served, and looking at the North Korean issue, or what it can serve in a geopolitical sense for the Yoon administration, no amount of clarity from the Yoon administration is going to alter India's course on those issues. If it doesn't directly affect India, and this has been the way through the Cold War, you know, since really the birth of India. With some other countries, particularly with the closer relationship with Japan, it will make a big difference. But I think coming to the G20 summit, particularly because it's been in India, and I think that's why Xi Jinping's not going to be there, it is, don't want to put a feather in the cap of India, is probably not going to make much difference.
Right. Jack, on a light note, during this week's diplomatic mission overseas, President Yoon Suk Yeol will also seek to rally support for Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. Now, there is concern that the recent challenges faced during the hosting of the World Scout Jamboree, which we discussed about a month ago, I believe, may reflect negatively on Busan's prospects. Do you share these concerns?
I don't. The Jamboree was a disaster, but it was a poorly chosen piece of revamped swampland without trees, and then it got bad luck on top of that. So it was a bad choice, and then you had rains, you had a heat wave, you had a typhoon, so it was this combination of really bad events. But South Korea has a great track record of putting on big events and doing it really well. A summer and a winter Olympics and lots of other events in between. The big challenges the big challenge for Busan, and the reason why President Yoon is trying to drum up support, is obviously Saudi Arabia and Italy are also going for this, and Italy will have all of Europe and a lot of Africa behind it. So South Korea really needs to muster numbers and get other countries to come in and support it. The infrastructure in Busan, where they've said needs maybe a few more top-grade hotels, or the hospitality needs to change a little bit, but the basic infrastructure is fantastic. I'm sure Korea could hold a fantastic event there. The big challenge will be, can it get the numbers? Can it, you know, really, Italy, I think, would be the big one to overcome there. But that's the challenge. I think the Jamboree itself is not largely forgotten, but in relation to Busan, I think that's already largely a non-issue.
Right, we'll keep our fingers crossed for Busan then. Moving forward, Sebastien, despite the presence of these global gatherings this week, now some claim that global cooperation itself remains the biggest challenge to overcoming universal matters of concern, including climate change and food shortages. How do you, Sebastien, respond?
Well, we have seen the past few months around summer, all around the planet, that these heat waves, these climate disaster, increasing number of typhoons. So clearly climate change is getting into our daily life. It's becoming something extremely vivid to most of us. But having said that, we're also facing these major economic and geopolitical challenges. And the question is there a risk that might divert the attention? When we see global cooperation being challenged through this meeting with this geopolitical tension, it doesn't bode well to find an agreement, and more importantly, to advance the agreement that were made in the past few years in the Paris conference, Copenhagen, and how to implement it, because it's all about implementation, about the money you allocate. And of course, at the moment, increasingly population are suffering, tightening their belt. We can see even here in South Korea, exports are down. This is a global phenomenon. I'm just back from Europe. Also in Europe, inflation is spectacular. So the question is how long people can, normal man in the street can hold this. And of course, for government, you can expect in the coming months and years, the focus is first of all to meet this demand from their population, especially if you want to be re-elected. So there's a big question about whether, climate change can be still a top priority. And then you add, of course, the geopolitical tension. We know that between US and China, which are the two biggest emitters, climate change issue still seems to be stuck. We've seen John Kerry, Special Envoy on Climate, finally making a trip to Beijing last July in order to relaunch that conversation with China. But still we can feel that, at least on the Chinese side, there is this idea that this is part of a bigger negotiation, and climate change is one item that could also be turned into a leverage if needed. So there is a lot of concern about whether you can actually push further that item in the coming months.
Right. Hopefully they will be able to in the near future then. All right, Sebastien, thank you so much for your insights. And Jack, as always, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Pleasure.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. As always, thank you for watching.